Chapter 5, Friday, August 19th, 1977. Paul and Mark sat cross-legged side by side on the dew-damp mountain grass. They were as still as stones. Even Mark, who loved inactivity and to whom patience was an irritant rather than virtue, did no more than blink his eye. Around them lay a breathtaking panorama of virtually unspoiled land. On three sides of their clearing, a dense purple-green, almost primeval forest rose like walls. To their right, the clearing opened at the head of a narrow valley, and the town of Black River, 2 miles away, shimmering like a patch of opalescent fungus on the emerald quilt on the wild lands. The only other scar of civilization was the big Union Mill, which was barely visible 3 miles on the other side of Black River. Even so, from this distance, the huge buildings did not resemble millwork so much as they did the ramparts, gates, and towers of castles. The plant forests that supplied Big Union, and which were less attractive than the natural woods, were out of sight beyond the next mountain. Blue sky and fast-moving white clouds overhung what could have passed for a scene of Eden in a biblical film. Paul and Mark were not interested in the scenery. Their attention was fixed on a small red-brown squirrel. For the past 5 days, they had been putting out food for the squirrel, dry roasted peanuts and section apples, hoping to make friends with it and gradually to domesticate it. Day by day, it crept closer to the food, and yesterday it took a few bites before succumbing to fear and scampering away. Now, as they watched, it came forth from the perimeter of the woods, 3 or 4 quick yet cautious steps at a time, pausing again and again to study the man and boy. When he finally reached the food, he picked up a piece of the apple in its tiny forepaws and, sitting back on its haunches, began to eat. When the animal finished the first slice and picked up another, Mark said, "He won't take his eyes off us, not even for a second." As the boy spoke, the squirrel became suddenly as still as they were. It cocked his head and fixed them into one large brown eye. Paul had said they could whisper, breaking their rules of silence. If the squirrel had gained courage since yesterday and managed to stay at the food for more than 3 few seconds, if they were to domesticate it, the animal would have to become accustomed to their voices. "Please don't be scared," Mark said softly. Paul had promised that if the squirrel could be tamed, Mark would be allowed to take it home and make a pet of it. "Please don't run away." Not yet prepared to trust them, it dropped the slice of apple, turned, bound into the forest, and scrambled to the upper branches of a maple tree. Mark jumped up. "Ah, heck! We wouldn't have hurt you, you dumb squirrel." Disappointment lined his face. "Stay calm. He'll be back again tomorrow," Paul said. He stood and stretched his stiff muscles. "He'll never trust us." "Yes, he will, little by little. We'll never tame him." "Little by little," Paul said. "He can't be converted in 1 week. You've got to be patient." "I'm not good at being patient, I know, but you'll learn." "Little by little?" "That's right," Paul said. He bent over, picked up the apple slices and peanuts and dropped them into a plastic bag. "Hey," Mark said, "maybe he's mad at us because we always take the food when we leave." Paul laughed. "Maybe so, but if he got in the habit of sneaking back and eating after we've gone, he wouldn't have any reason to come out while we're here." As they started back towards camp, which lay at the far end of the 200-yard-long mountain meadow, Paul gradually became aware again of the beautiful day, as if it were a mosaic for the senses, falling into place around him piece by piece. The warm summer breeze, white daisies gleaming in the grass, and here and there a buttercup, the odour of grass and earth and wild flowers, the constant rustle of leaves and the gentle soughing of the breeze in the pine boughs, the trilling of birds, the solemn shadows of the forest. High above, a hawk wheeled into sight, the last piece of the mosaic. Its shrill cry seemed filled with pride, as if it knew that it had capped the scene, as if it thought it had pulled down the sky with its wings. The time had come for their weekly trip into town to replenish their supply of perishable goods, but for a moment he didn't want to leave the mountain. Even Black River, nearly isolated from the modern world, singularly peaceful, which would seem precious when compared to the serenity of the forest. But of course, Black River offered more than fresh eggs, milk, butter, and other groceries. Jenny was there. As they drew near the camp, Mark ran ahead. He pushed aside a pair of yellow canvas flaps and peered into the large tent that they had erected in the shadow of several 80-foot hemlocks and firs. A second later, he turned away from the tent, cupped his hands around his mouth, and shouted, "Raya, hey, Raya." "Here," she said, coming out from behind the tent. For an instant, Paul couldn't believe what he saw: a small young squirrel perched on her right arm, its claws hooked to the sleeve of her corduroy jacket. It was chewing on a piece of apple, and she was petting it gently. "How did you do it?" he asked. "Chocolate?" She grinned. "I started out trying to lure it with the same bait you and Mark have been using, but when I figured that a squirrel can probably get nuts and apples on its own, but he can't get chocolate, I figured the smell would be irresistible, and it was. He was eating out of my hand by Wednesday, but I didn't want you to know about him until I was sure he'd gotten over the worst of his fears of humans. He's not eating chocolate now. Too much of it wouldn't be good for him." The squirrel raised its head and looked quizzingly at Paul. Then it continued gnawing on the piece of apple in its forepaws. "Do you like him, Mark?" Rye said. As she spoke, a grin melted into a frown. Paul saw why. The boy was close to tears. He wanted a squirrel of his own, but he knew they couldn't take two of the animals home with them. His lower lip quivered. However, he was determined not to cry. Raya recovered quickly. Smiling, she said, "Well, Mark, do you like him?" "I'll be upset if you don't. I went to an awful lot of trouble to get him for you." "You little sweetheart," Paul thought. Thinking back to his Mark said, "For me, of course," she said. "You mean you're giving him to me?" She feigned surprise. "Who else? I thought he was yours." "Now what would I want with a pet squirrel?" she asked. "He'll be a good pet for a boy, but he would be all wrong for a girl." She put the animal on the ground and hunkered down beside it, fishing a piece of candy from her pocket. She said, "Come on, you've got to feed him some chocolate if you really want to make friends with him." The squirrel plucked the candy from Mark's hand and nibbled it with obvious pleasure. The boy was also in ecstasy as he gently stroked its flanks and long tail. When the chocolate was gone, the animal sniffed, first at Mark and then at Raya, and when it realized there would be no more treats today, it slipped out from between them and dashed towards the trees. "Hey," Mark said. He ran after her until he saw that it was much faster than he. "Don't worry," Raya said. "He'll come back tomorrow, so long as we have some chocolate for him. If we tame him." Mark said, "Can I take him into town next week?" "We'll see," Paul said. He looked at his watch. "If we're going to spend today in town, we'd better get moving." The station wagon was parked half a mile away at the end of a weed-choked dirt lane that was used by hunters in late autumn and early winter. True to form, Mark shouted, "Last one to the cars are dope." He ran ahead along the path that snaked down through the woods, and in a few seconds he was out of sight. Raya walked at Paul's side. "That was a very nice thing you did," he said. She pretended not to know what he meant. "Getting the squirrel for Mark, it was fun." "You didn't get it to Mark." "Sure I did. Who else would I get it for?" "Yourself," Paul said. "But when you saw how much it meant to him to have a squirrel of his own, you gave it up." "Sugar miss, you must think I'm a saint or something. If I really wanted that squirrel, I wouldn't have given him away. Not in a million years." "You're not a good liar," he said affectionately. Exasperated, she said, "Fathers," hoping he wouldn't notice her embarrassment. Then she ran ahead, shouted to Mark, and was soon out of sight beyond a dense patch of mountain laurel. "Children," he said aloud, but there was no exasperation in his voice, only love. Since Annie's death, he had spent more time with the children than he might have done if she had lived, partly because there was something of her in Mark and Raya, and he felt that he was keeping in touch with her through them. He had learned that each of them was quite different from the other, each with its unique outlook and abilities, and he cherished their individuality. Raya would always know more about life, people, and the rules of the game than Mark would. Curious, probing, patient, seeking knowledge, she would enjoy life from an intellectual vantage point. She would know that especially intense passion, sexual, emotional, mental, which none but the very bright ever experience. On the other hand, although Mark would face life with far less understanding than Raya, he was not to be pitied, not for a moment, brimming with enthusiasm, quick to laugh, overwhelmingly optimistic. He would live every one of his days with gusto. If he was denied complex pleasures and satisfaction of the world to compensate for that, he would ever be in tune with the simple joys of life, in which Raya, while understanding them, would never be able to indulge herself fully without some self-consciousness. Paul knew that in days to come, each of his children would bring him a special kind of happiness and pride unless death took them from him. As if he had walked into an invisible barrier, he stopped in the middle of the trail and swayed slightly from side to side. Then that last thought had taken him completely by surprise. When he lost Annie, he had thought for a time that he had lost all that was worth having. Her death made him painfully aware that everything, even deeply felt, strong personal relationships that nothing life could twist or destroy, was temporary, pawned to the grave. For the past 3.5 years, in the back of his mind, a small voice had been telling him to be prepared for death, to expect it, and not to let the loss of Margaret or anyone else, if it came, shatter him, as Annie's death had nearly done. But until now the voice had been almost subconscious, an urgent counsel of which he was only vaguely aware. This was the first time that he had let it pop loose from the subconscious. As it raised the surface, it startled him. A shiver passed through him from head to foot. He had an eerie sense of precognition. Then it was gone as quickly as it had come. An animal moved in the underbush. Overhead, above the company of trees, a hawk screamed. Suddenly the summer forest screamed. The forest seemed much too dark, too dense, too wild, sinister. You're being foolish, he thought. You're no fortune teller. You're no clairvoyant. Nevertheless, he hurried along the winding path, anxious to catch up with Mark and Raya. At 11:15 that morning, Dr. Walter Troutman was at the big mahogany desk in his surgery. He was eating at an early lunch: 2 roast beef sandwiches, an orange, a banana, an apple, a cup of butterscotch pudding, and several glasses of iced tea, and reading a medical journal. As the only physician in Black River, he felt he had two primary responsibilities to the people in the area. The first was to be certain that in the event of a catastrophe at the mill or some other medical crisis, he would never find himself undernourished and in want of energy to fulfill his duties. The second was to be aware of all developments in medical techniques and theory, so that people who came to him would receive the most modern treatment available. Scores of satisfied patients and the reverence and affection with which the whole town regarded him testified to his success in meeting his second responsibility. As for the first, he stood 5'11" and weighed 270 pounds. When an overweight patient in the middle of one of his doctor's lectures had the temerity to mention Troutman's own excess poundage, he had always countered with the same joke. "Obese? Me?" Troutman would ask, clearly astonished. "This isn't a fat I'm carrying. It's stored energy ready to be tapped if there's ever a catastrophe up at the mill." Then he would continue his lecture. In truth, of course, he was an almost compulsive eater, and had been all his life. By the time he was 30, he had given up dieting and psychotherapy as truly lost causes. The same year, having been guaranteed a handsome stipend by the big union supply company, he had come to Black River, where the people were so pleased to have a doctor of their own that they didn't care if he was fat, thin, white, black, or green. For 20 years now, he had been accommodating his compulsion, stuffing himself with cakes and cookies and pies and 5 square meals a day, and in sum he felt that his life held more enjoyment than any other man he knew. As he was about to enjoy it even more, as he was picking up the second roast beef sandwich, the telephone rang. He considered not answering it, but he was the kind of doctor who went out on house calls at any other day or night. Even lunch had to be put aside if a patient needed him. He picked up the receiver. "Hello? Dr. Troutman?" "Yes." The voice on the end of the line was cold and sharp. "I'm the key." "Dr. Troutman." "I'm the lock," Troutman said without hesitation. "Are you alone in the house?" "Yes." "Where is your nurse, Miss MacDonald?" "I don't know. At home, I suppose." "When will she be coming to work?" "Half an hour before the office opens." "And the office opens at 1:30? "That's correct," Troutman said. "Are you expecting anyone else before 1 o'clock?" "No, no one." The stranger was silent for a moment. Troutman listened to his desk clock ticking. He glanced at the food laid out on a linen napkin in front of him, picked a sliver of roast beef from the sandwich, and ate it quickly like a fish taking a fly. When the man on the other end of the line had decided on his approach, he said, "I'm going to ask you a number of important questions, Doctor. You will give me complete answers to the best of your ability." "Yes, of course." "Have you recently had an epidemic of any sort in Black River?" "Yes, we have." "Of what?" "Night chills." "Explain what you mean by that term, Doctor." "Severe chills, cold sweats, nausea, but without vomiting, and the resultant insomnia." "When was the first case reported to you?" "Wednesday, the 10th of this month, 9 days ago." "Did any of your patients mention nightmares?" "Every one of them said he'd been awakened by a terrible dream." "Could any of them remember what it was?" "No, none of them." "What treatment did you provide?" "I gave placebos to the first few, but then I suffered the chills myself on Wednesday night, and when there were scores of new cases on Thursday, I began to prescribe a low-grade antibiotic." "That had no effect, of course." "None whatsoever." "Did you refer any patients to another physician's?" "No, the nearest other doctor is 60 miles away, and he's in his late 70s. However, I did request an investigation by the State Health Authority." The stranger was silent for a moment. "Then you did that merely because there was an epidemic of rather mild influenza?" "It was mild," Troutman said, "but decidedly unusual. No fever, no swelling of the glands, and yet, for as mild as it was, it spread throughout the town and the mill. Within 24 hours, everyone had it. Of course, I wondered if it might not be influenza at all, but some sort of poisoning." "Poisoning?" Yes, of a common food or water supply. When did you contact the health authority? Friday the 12th, late in the afternoon. And then, and they sent a man? Not until Monday. Was this still an epidemic at the time? No, Troutman said. Everyone in town had the chills, the cold, the sweats, and the nausea again Saturday night, but no one was ill Sunday night. Whatever it was, it disappeared even more suddenly than it came. Did the state authorities still run an investigation? Intently studying the food on the napkin, Troutman shifted his chair and said, "Oh yes, Dr. Evans, one of their junior field men, spent all of Monday and most of Tuesday interviewing people and taking tests." Tests? You mean food and water? Yes, blood and urine samples too. Did he take water samples from the reservoir? Yes, he filled at least 20 vials in bottles. Has he filed his report yet? Troutman licked his lip and said, "Yes, he called me last evening to give me the results of the test. I suppose he found nothing?" "That's correct. All tests were negative." "Does he have any theories?" the stranger asked, a vague trace of anxiety in his voice. That bothered Troutman. The key should not be anxious. The key had all the answers. He believes that we've experienced a rare case of mass psychological illness, an epidemic of formulated hysteria. Yes, exactly. Then he's making no recommendations. None that I know of. He has terminated the investigation. That's what he told me. The stranger sighed softly. "Doctor, earlier you told me that everyone in town and at the mill had experienced the night chills. Were you speaking figuratively or literally?" "Figuratively," Troutman said. "There were exceptions, perhaps 20 children, all under 8 years of age, and 2 adults, Sam Edison and his daughter Jenny." "The people who run the general store." "That's correct. They didn't suffer from the chills at all." "Not at all." "Are they connected to the town's water supply?" "Everyone in town is." "All right. What about the lumbermen who worked in the planned forest beyond the mill? Some of them virtually live out there." "Were they affected?" "Yes, that was something Dr. Evans wanted to know too," Truman said. "He's interviewed all of them." The stranger said, "I've no more questions, Miss Dr. Troutman, but I do have some orders for you. When you hang up your receiver, you instantly wipe all memory of our conversation from your mind. Do you understand?" "Yes, perfectly." "You forget every word we exchange. You erase this memory from both your conscious and subconscious so that it can never be recalled, no matter how much you might wish to recall it." "Understood." Troutman nodded somberly. "Yes. When you hang up your receiver, you remember only that the phone rang and that it was a wrong number. Is that clear?" "A wrong number. Yes, that's clear." "Very well. Hang up, Doctor." Carelessness, Troutman thought, a bit irascibly, as he put down the receiver. If people paid attention to what they were doing, they wouldn't dial so many wrong numbers or make 1/10 of the other mistakes that peppered their lives. How many patients, badly cut or burned, had he treated who had been injured only because they were inattentive, careless? Scores, hundreds, thousands. Sometimes when he opened the door of his waiting room and peered inside, he had the feeling that he had just pulled a pan from the oven and was staring not at people, but at a row of wide-eyed trout with gaping mouths, and now tying up a doctor's line with a wrong number, even for half a minute or so. Well, that could be damn serious. He shook his head, dismayed by the ineptitude and inefficiency of his fellow citizens. Then he grabbed the roast beef sandwich and took an enormous bite from it. At 11:45, Paul Annandale stepped into Sam Edison's study on the second floor of the house, just above the general store. "Squire Edison, I wish to arrange to take your daughter to lunch." Sam was standing in front of a bookcase. A large volume lay open in his left hand, and he was paging through it with his right. "Sit down, Vassal," he said without looking up. "The squire will be with you in just a minute." If Sam had chosen to refer to this place as his library rather than his study, he would have been justified. 2 lushly cushioned, somewhat tattered armchairs and 2 matching footstools stood in the centre of the room, facing the only window. 2 yellow shaded floor lamps, one behind each chair, provided adequate but restful light, and a small rectangular table lay between the chairs. A pipe was turned upside down in a large ashtray on the table, and the air was redolent with the cherry scent of Sam's tobacco. The room was only 12 feet by 15 feet, but 2 entire walls, from floor to ceiling, were lined with thousands of books and hundreds of issues of various psychological journals. Paul sat down, put his feet up on a stool. He didn't know the title of the volume that the other man was looking through, but he did know that 90% of these books dealt with Hitler, Nazism, and anything else that was even remotely related to the philosophical political nightmare. Sam's interest in the subject had been unwavering for 32 years. In April of 1945, as a member of American intelligence unit, Sam went into Berlin less than 24 hours behind the first Allied troops. He was shocked by the extent of this destruction. In addition to the ruin caused by Allied bombers, mortars, and tank fire, there were damage directly attributed to the fires scorched the earth policy. In the final days of the war, the madman had decreed that the victors, must be allowed to seize nothing of value, that Germany must be transformed into a barren plain of rubble, that not even one house could be left standing to come under the foreign domination. Of course, most Germans were not prepared to take this final step into oblivion. Although many of them were, it seemed to Sam that the Germans he saw in the devastated streets were survivors, not merely of war, but also of the frenzied suicide of an entire nation. On May 8, 1945, he was transferred to an intelligence unit that was collecting data on the Nazi death camp. As the full story of the Holocaust became known, as it was discovered that millions of men and women and children had passed through the gas chambers and hundreds of thousands of others had been shot in the back and buried in trenches, Sam Innocent, a young man from the backwoods of Maine, found nothing within his experience to explain such mind-numbing horror. Why had so many once rational, basically good people committed themselves to fulfilling the evil fantasies of an obvious lunatic and handful of subordinate madmen? Why had most of the most professional armies in the world disgraced itself by fighting to protect the SS murderers? Why had millions of people gone with so little protest to the concentration camps and gas chambers? What did Adolf Hitler know about the psychology of the masses that had helped him to achieve such an absolute power? The ruin of the German cities and the death camps data raised all of these questions but provided answers to none of them. He was sent back to the States and mustered out of service in October 1945, and as soon as he was home, he began to buy books about Hitler, the Nazis, and the war. He read everything of value that he could find. Bits and pieces of explanation, theories, and arguments seemed valid to him, but the complete answer that he sought eluded him. Therefore, he extended his area of study and began collecting books on totalitarianism, militarism, war games, battle strategies, German history, German philosophy, bigotry, racism, paranoia, mob psychology, behavior modification, and mind control. His undismissible fascination with Hitler did not have its roots in morbid curiosity, but came instead from a fearful certainty that the German people were not all unique, and that his own neighbours in Maine, given the right set of circumstances, would be capable of some atrocities. Sam suddenly closed the book through which he had been paging for the past few minutes and returned it to the shelf. Damn it, I know they're here somewhere. From his armchair, Paul said, "What are you looking for?" His head tilted slightly to the right. Sam continued to read the titles on the binding. "We've got a sociologist doing research in town. I know I've got several of his articles in my collection, but I'll be damned if I can find them." "Sociologist? What sort of research?" "I don't know exactly. He came into the store early this morning, had dozens of questions to ask, said he was a sociologist, came all the way out from Washington. I was making a study of Black River. Said he'd rented a room at Pauline Vickers' place and would be there for 3 weeks or so. According to him, Black River is pretty special." "In what way?" "For one thing, it's a prosperous company town in an age when company towns have supposedly fallen into decay or vanished altogether, and because we're geographically isolated, it'll be easier for him to analyze the effects of television on our social patterns." Oh, he had at least half a dozen good reasons why we're right material for sociological research, but I don't think he got around to explaining his main theses, whatever it is he's trying to prove or disprove. He took another book from the shelf, opening it to the table of contents, closed it almost at once, and put it back where he'd gotten it. "Do you know his name?" "Introduced himself as Albert Dayton," Sam said. The name didn't ring a bell, but the face did. Meek-looking man, thin lips, receding hairline, glasses as thick as the lenses on a telescope. Those glasses make his eyes look like they're popping right out of his head. I know I've seen his picture several times in books or magazines, alongside articles he's written. He sighed and turned away from the bookshelf for the first time since Paul came into the room. With one hand, he smoothed his white beard. "I can spend all evening up here picking through these books. Right now, you want me to take over the counter downstairs so you can escort my daughter to the elegant, incomparable Altman's Cafe for lunch." Paul laughed. "Jenny tells me there's no more flu in town, so the worst we can get at Altman says food poisoning. What about the kids? Mark's spending the afternoon with Bob Thorpe's boys. He's been invited to lunch and he'll spend it mooning over Emma. Still has a crush on her, does he? He thinks he's in love, but he'll never admit it. Sam's craggy face was softened by a smile, and Raya. Emma asked her to come along with Mark, but if you don't mind looking after her, she'd rather stay here with you. Mind, don't be ridiculous. As he got up from the armchair, Paul said, why don't you put her to work after lunch? She could come up here and pore through these books until she found Dayton's name on a table of contents. What a dull piece of work for a preppy girl like her. Raya wouldn't be bored, Paul said. It's right down her alley. She likes working with books, and she enjoys doing you a favour. Sam hesitated, then shrugged and said, maybe I'll ask her. When I read what Dayton's written, I know where his interest lies, and I'll have a better idea of what he's up to now. You know me, as curious as the day is long. Once I've got a bean bomb in my bonnet. I've just got to take it out and see whether it's worker, drone queen, or maybe even a wasp. Altman's cafe stood on the southwest corner of the town square, shaded by a pair of enormous black oak trees. The restaurant was 80 feet long, and an aluminium and glass structure meant to look like an old-fashioned railroad passenger car. It had one narrow window road that ran around three sides and tracked on the front of an entrance fire that spoiled the railroad car effect. Inside, booths upholstered in blue plastic stood beside the windows. The tables of each booth held an ashtray, a cylindrical glass sugar dispenser, salt and pepper shakers, a napkin dispenser, and a selector for the jukebox. And I'll separate the booths on the counter that ran the length of the restaurant. Ogden Salisbury was in the corner booth at the north end of the cafe. He was drinking a second cup of coffee and watching the other customers. At 1:50 in the afternoon, most of the lunch hour rush had passed. Altman was nearly deserted. In a booth near the door, an elderly couple was reading the weekly newspaper, eating roast beef and French fries, and quietly arguing politics. The chief of police, Bob Thorpe, was a stool on the counter, finishing his lunch and joking with a grey-haired waitress named Beth. At the far end of the room, Jenny Edison was in the other corner booth with a good-looking man in his late 30s. Salisbury didn't know him, but assumed he worked at the mill or in the logging camp. Of the 5 other customers, Jenny was of the greatest interest to Salisbury. A few hours ago, when he talked to Dr. Troutman, he learned that neither Jenny nor his father had complained of the night chills. The fact that the number of children had also escaped them did not disturb him. The effects of the sublingual was in part directly proportional to the subject's language skills and reading ability, and he had expected that some children would be unaffected, but Sam and Jenny were adults, and they should not have been untouched. Possibly they hadn't consumed any of the drugs. If that was true, then they hadn't drunk any of the water from the town system, hadn't used it to make ice cubes, and hadn't cooked with it. That was marginally possible, he supposed. Marginally. However, the drug had also been introduced into 14 products at the food wholesaler's warehouse in Bangor before those products were shipped to Black River, and it was difficult for him to believe that they could have been so fortunate as to have avoided by chance every contaminated substance. There was a second possibility. It was conceivable, although highly improbable, that the Edison had taken the drug but hadn't come into contact with any of the sophisticated subliminal programming that had been designed with such care for the Black River experiment, and that had inundated the town through half a dozen forms of print and electronic media for a period of 7 days. Salisbury was nearly certain that neither of these explanations was correct, and that the truth was both complex and technical. Even the most beneficial drugs did not have a benign effect on everyone. Any drug could be counted upon to sicken or kill at least a tiny percentage of these people to whom it was administered. Moreover, for virtually every drug, there were some people, another extremely small group, who were either minimally affected or utterly untouched by it, owing to differences in metabolism, variance in body chemistry, and unknown factors. More likely than not, Jenny and Sam Nissen had taken the subliminal primer in water or food, but hadn't been altered by it, either not at all or not as they should have been, and subsequently was unimpressed by the subliminal because they hadn't been much ready for them. Eventually, he would have to give the two of them a series of examination tests at a fully equipped medical clinic, with the hope that he could find what it was that made them impervious to the drug. But that could wait. During the next 3 weeks, he would be quietly recording and studying the effects of the effects that the drug and subliminals produced in the other people of Black River. Although Salisbury was more interested in Jenny than in any of the other customers, most of them time, his attention was focused on the younger Altman, two waitresses. She was a lean, lithe brunette with dark eyes and honey complex, perhaps 25 years old, a captivating smile, a rich, throaty voice perfect for the bedroom. To Salisbury, every movement was filled with sexual innuendo and all but open invitation to violation. More important, however, the waitress reminded him of Miriam, the wife he had divorced 27 years ago. Like Miriam, she had small, high-set breasts and very supple, beautiful, supple legs. Her throaty voice resembled Miriam's, and she had Miriam's walk, an unstudied grace in every step, and unconscious and sinuous rolling of the hips that took his breath away. He wanted her, but he would never take her because she reminded him too much of Miriam, reminding him of the frustrations, angers, and disappointment of that awful 5-year marriage. She stirred his lust, but she also stirred his somewhat suppressed, long-nurtured hatred of Miriam, and by extension of women in general. He knew that the act, as he achieved penetration, began to move her resemblance to Miriam, would leave him impotent. When she brought the check for his lunch, flashing that dazzling smile that had begun to seem smug and superior to him, he said, "I am the key." He was taking an unwarranted risk. He couldn't defend it even to himself until it was certain that everyone in town, other than the Edisons, had a handful of children, was properly programmed. He should restrict the use of the command phrase to telephone conversation, as with Troutman, and to situations wherein he was alone with the subject and free from fear of interruptions. Only after 3 weeks of observation and interval contact could he even be interested in. There was no risk involved, and now on one level he was a bit disturbed that he was conducting himself irresponsibly on his first day in town. He did particularly mind if absolute power corrupted him absolutely, just so it didn't make him overconfident and careless. On the other hand, so long as they kept their voices low, there was little chance that they would be overheard. The elderly couple in the booth by the door was nearer to Salisbury than anyone else in the cafe, and they were half a room away. Besides, unwarranted risk or not, he couldn't resist taking control of this woman. His emotions had unseated his reason, and he was riding with them. "I'm the lock," she said. "Keep your voice low." "Yes, sir." "What is your name?" "Alice." "How old are you?" 26. "You're lovely," he said. She was smiling. "Smile for me, Alice." She smiled. She didn't look the least bit dazed. Even her big dark eyes held no hint of trance, yet she was unhesitatingly obedient. He said, "You have a nice body, thank you. Do you like sex?" "Yeah." "Do you like it very much?" "Yeah, I like it." "When you're in bed with a man, is anything you won't let him do to you?" "Yeah." "Greek." "You won't let him take you in the ass?" She blushed and said, "Yeah, I don't like that. If I wanted to, I could have you." She just stared at him. "Couldn't I?" "Yeah. If I wanted you, I could have you right now, right here on top of this table." "Yeah. If I wanted to take you Greek style, I could." She resisted the idea, but finally said, "Is that what you want?" "If I did want it, I could have it. You'd let me?" "Yeah." It was his turn to smile. He glanced around the cafe. No one was looking at them. No one had heard. "Are you married, Alice?" "No." "Divorce?" "Why did you get a divorce?" "He couldn't hold a job." "Your husband couldn't?" "Yeah, him." "Was he good in bed?" "Not very." She was even more like Miriam than he thought. After all these years, he could still remember what Miriam had said to him the day she left. "You're not just bad in bed, Ogden. You're terrible, and you've no inclination to learn. But you know, I could live with that if there were compensations, if you had money and could buy me things. Maybe I could live with your fumbling sex. When I said I'd marry you, I thought you were going to make lots of money. Jesus Christ, you were on the top of the class at Harvard. When you complete your doctorate, everyone wanted to hire you. If you had any ambitions whatsoever, you'd had already gotten your hands on a decent piece of money. You know that, Ogden. I think you're inept and unimaginative in your research as you are in bed. You're never going to get anywhere, but I am. I'm getting out." What a bitch she had been. Just thinking about her, he began to tremble and perspire. Alice was still smiling. He stopped smiling. He said softly, "I don't like it." She did as he was told. "What am I, Alice?" "You're the key." "And what are you?" "The lock. Now that I've opened you, you'll do whatever I tell you to do. Isn't that true?" "Yeah." He took 3 $1 bills from his wallet and put them on top of the lunch check. "I'm going to test you, Alice. I'm going to just see how obedient you are." She waited docilely. "When you leave this table," he said, "you take the check and money to the cash register. You ring up the cell and take your tip from whatever's left of the $3. Is that clear?" "Yeah." "Then you go in the kitchen. Is there anyone back there?" "No." Randy went to the bank. "Randy Altman?" "Yes." "That's good," Salisbury said. "Now when you go to the kitchen, you pick up a meat fork, a cook's fork, or one of those big 2-pronged forks. Is there one of those in the kitchen? Yes, several. You pick one of them up and stab yourself with it, run it all the way through your left hand. She didn't even blink. Is that understood, Alice? Yeah, I understand. When you turn away from this table, you forget everything we've said to each other. Understand? Yeah. When you run the fork through your hand, you think it was an accident. A freak accident, won't you, Alice? Sure, an accident. Go away then. She turned and walked to the half door at the end of the lunch counter. Her smooth hips rolled provocatively. When she reached the cash register and began to ring up the sale, Salisbury slid out of the booth and started towards the door. She dropped her tip into the pocket of her uniform, closed the cash register drawer, and went into the kitchen. At the entrance, Salisbury stopped and put a quarter in the newspaper vending machine. Bob Thorpe laughed loudly at some joke, and the waitress named Bess giggled like a young girl. Salisbury took a copy of the Black River Bulletin from a wire rack, folded it, put under his arm, and opened the door to the foyer. He stepped across the sill and began to pull the door shut behind him, thinking all the while, "Come on, you bitch, come on." His heart was pounding, and he felt slightly dizzy. Alice began to scream. Grinning, Salisbury closed the first door, pushed through the outer door, went down the stairs, and walked east on Main Street, as if he was unaware of the uproar in the cafe. The day was bright and warm. The sky was cloudless. He had never been happier. Paul shouldered past Bob Thorpe and stepped into the kitchen. The young waitress was standing at a counter that lay between two upright food freezers. His left hand was palmed down on a wooden cutting board. With her right hand she gripped an 18-inch long meat fork. The two wickedly sharp prongs appeared to have been driven all the way through her left hand and into the wood beneath. Blood splattered. Her light blue uniform glistened on the cutting board and dripping from the edge of the formica-topped counter. She was screaming and grasping for breath between the screams and shaking and trying to wrench the fork loose. Turning back to Bob Thorpe, who had transfixed in the doorway, Paul said, "Get Doc Troutman." Thorpe didn't have to be told again. He hurried away, taking hold of the woman's right hand. Paul said, let go of the fork. I want you to let go of the fork. You're doing more harm than good." She raised her head and seemed to look straight through him. Her face was chalky beneath her dark complexion. She was obviously in shock. She couldn't stop screaming, an undulating wail, more animal than human. And she probably didn't even know that he had spoken to her. He had to pry her hands from the handle of the fork, and he sighed. Jenny said, "Oh my God, hold her for me," he said. "Don't let her grab the fork." Jenny gripped the woman's right wrist. She said, "I think I'm going to be sick." Paul wouldn't have blamed her if she had been just that. In the tiny restaurant kitchen, with the ceiling only a few inches above their heads, the screaming was deafening. The sight of the slender hand with the fork embedded in it was horrifying, the stuff of nightmares. The air was thick with the stale odour of baking ham, roast beef, fried onion grease, and the fresh metallic tang of blood. It was enough to nauseate anyone. But he said, "You won't be sick. You're a tough lady." She bit her lower lip and nodded quickly, as if he had been prepared and waiting for exactly this emergency. Paul took a dishcloth from the towel rack and tore it into two strips. He threw one of these aside. With the other length of cloth and a long wooden tasting spoon, he fashioned a tourniquet for the waitress's left arm. He twisted the wooden spoon with his right hand and covered the handle of the meat fork with his left. To Jenny, he said, "Come around here and take the tourniquet." As soon as her right hand was free, the waitress tried to get to the handle of the fork. She clawed at Paul's fist. Jenny took hold of the spoon. Pressing down the waitress's wounded hand, Paul jerked up on the fork, which was sunk into the wood, perhaps half an inch past her flesh, and pulled the tines from her in one sudden clean movement. He dropped the fork and slipped an arm around her waist to keep her from falling. Her knees began to buckle. He had thought they might. As he stretched the woman on the floor, Jenny said, "She must be in awful pain." Those words seemed to shadow the waitress' terror. She stopped screaming and began to cry. "I don't see how she did it," Paul said as he tended her. She put the fork through her hand with incredible force. She was pinned to the board. Weeping, trembling, and said, "Accident." She gasped and groaned and shook her head. "Terrible accident." Thanks for listening.